So Inderjeet, you've done a lot of very interesting work on the connections between foundations, mostly American foundations, and American foreign policy. I think for a lot of people, they see it as a good thing that you have a lot of foundations essentially helping to promote democracy, human rights, development, and so forth. You, however, seem to be a bit more critical. Could you maybe summarize a little bit your critique of that nexus that exists between the two?
Sure. I think most important thing is that the foundations have this image which they promote, that they are beyond the market, beyond big business, they're independent of politics and of the state, and that they exist in some other sphere, which means that they are not corrupted by big money or big power. Yet when you look at their history and their development over time, you find that they're actually immersed in the corporate economy. They're the products of late 19th century kind of high-tech industrialization of that period. And they're formed as political interventions, but using the tools of social science in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So they're very deeply political, because part of what happens in the US in the late 19th century is a very large amount of change. Rapid urbanization, industrialization, mass immigration, and the rise of all sorts of movements, including socialistic and anarchistic movements and movements of trade union organization. So in a way, the foundations are the way in which big corporations try to manage change and channel it in particular directions. So my critique of them begins with that acknowledgement that they were intensely political from the very beginning and very pro-corporate as well, and that they were trying to channel change to modernize American society, politics and economy, and to build a kind of new place for America in the world. Mm-hmm. And so therefore they were never disinterested or non-partisan or detached and objective as they claimed in the first place. And as the United States increased in its power, they played a very major role in consolidating their domestic positions, their thinking, and linking with various state structures and building those state structures as well. Mm-hmm. So my argument is from the beginning that they were not the kind of images that they portrayed of themselves. And so in American foreign policy, then they become adjuncts of the state while remaining formally private, but that they blur the lines and distinctions between public and private very, very effectively. So they're private institutions in the public service in their view, and they collaborate with those elements within the American state which they find most conducive at any one particular time in order to sort of promote this kind of globalism or liberal internationalism. And so yeah, I would say that's the sort of foundations of my own critique of
Maybe you can expand a little bit more on the methods and the mechanisms through which they exercise their power. Is it just purely intellectual, as in they just shape the research agenda of the people they fund? Or is it actually structural and political in that they maybe, I don't know, channel some of the productive energies that might have gone into far more political, say, structural projects into projects that are far more market friendly? Is it both? Are there any other effects? And maybe if you can indicate historically how those methods have evolved, because probably the foundations of today are somewhat different from those of the 1960s or 1970s.
Sure. I mean, their methods are really, they are kind of knowledge network builders, I would say. They build knowledge networks, and these knowledge networks are, in a Foucauldian sort of sense, power knowledge networks. They are not pure and simple knowledge, but they mobilize social scientific knowledge in the main, and they link that with projects to build the American state and to reform the politics of that society as well, to modernize it into the 20th century and to build a powerful enough state structure. I think the key thing is to remember that the United States has some peculiarities of historical development, which means it's a democracy in a limited way, a democracy before it has a state. Whereas European societies are very strong states, but they don't have much political representation of people outside of the relatively small polity. So in effect, what happens is that the state, as it develops in the US, is relatively small as a kind of institutional set of structures, but it develops as voluntary organizations carrying out what in Europe were state functions. So effectively those areas which they champion, such as social reform or the reform of the urban slum or poverty or the police force or the state itself or state institutions themselves, they actually pioneer the institutional frames which then later on they are effectively able to persuade state institutions to take over. So they initially start off as quasi-state, private, then quasi-state, and then within the state itself. And they do this in a whole number of different ways. They work with the universities, for example, in order to build up their knowledge of particular areas of the world, in area studies, international relations or sociology. And they build up these kind of knowledge networks which connect the production of knowledge about the world to those elements within the state which are dealing with the world in particular ways. And in that respect, I guess what they really do is build this kind of knowledge network of academics producing useful knowledge for diplomats and policymakers, such that they can intervene more effectively outside the United States. So in that regard, they are quasi-state institutions, despite the fact that they're private. And I would argue that sort of ideas of Antonio Gramsci probably fit reasonably well with the kind of functions that these institutions perform. And so I think that the philanthropy of today, the so-called philanthropy of today, is what is called philanthrocapitalism. So while these institutions were very interested in the preservation of capitalism and the development of capitalism and its protection by a new state which could ward off socialistic, communistic and other kind of threatening movements, the current crop, which is a product, if you like, of the 1990s kind of dot-com and high-tech revolution of the last century, they are, if you like, the kind of neoliberal kinds of philanthropy, philanthrocapitalism. They actually are, first of all, using the methods of big business much more directly. They're governed much more by performance indicators in a much more narrow way, whereas the old institutions, I think, in a way, had a kind of idea that they were funds of money which could be spent without too much accountability to anybody else, and therefore you could take risks with projects which institutions which were governed by shareholders or by voters couldn't do. Whereas the philanthrocapitalists of today, the Zuckerbergs and the Gates, they tend to be governed much more by actually trying to generate income and generate profit, actual political, not just political profit, but financial profits as well. And therefore they justify themselves giving money to corporations in order to do kind of what they believe are socially useful and good things. So when you look at the Gates Foundation, for example, they put quite a lot of money in projects which involve private corporations as well as intergovernmental and government organizations in the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, for example, where they say that Africa missed the Green Revolution, which occurred in Asia in the 1960s, and it needs to benefit from it. And they work with Monsanto and many other kind of institute and GM corporations, and they do this. They sideline domestic forms of production, which have been well established and are actually quite productive in terms of food production and so on. And they do this in the area of health and healthcare as well. And effectively, they insert the market into the relationship in the production of food and the production of healthcare much more overtly than did the Rockefellers, the Carnegies and the Fords. Although they did do this as well, but in a much more kind of indirect, longer term way. And I guess because they're the products of a neoliberal era, where the kind of the corporate chieftain like Gates is revered as the kind of person who's created this massive wealth, massive corporate wealth, and is now giving it away. $43 billion worth of endowment in the Gates Foundation. But actually, when you look at the kind of giving that is going on, it's a great deal of power projection as well, and is done with US aid in tow, as well as these other private corporations as well.
I want to ask about the strategies of resistance that countries, cities, other institutions that have realized the political and geopolitical role that foundations play could pursue. In a sense, what I notice in the work of many foundations, especially American ones, is that they align themselves, often quite selectively, with very popular or at least reasonable causes, while promoting a lot of other things.
Yes.
So, they would come and promote gay rights in a country that bashes gays,
Yes.
while also doing a lot of rather subversive work on politics and economics.
Yes.
And when the government of that country would like to throw that foundation out, they immediately say, well, it's an attack on gay rights. Right? So they're very good at sort of appealing to this humanitarian, cosmopolitan spirit within us. What are some of the strategies that have worked or could work that you see in your own research that cities governments could actually pursue when they're facing a threat such as this one?
That's a really good question, and actually it's very difficult to resist that kind of, because they come bearing gifts, often to relatively poor countries which need large resources. And so you often have the poorer countries inviting them in and hoping, for them to set up English language teaching institutions or modern style business schools and things like that, which they believe will help them to develop their resources and that kind of thing. And they do often support things like human rights or intellectual freedom. But very often these are very pointed efforts at undermining a particular kind of regime which they wish in the longer term to reform or to effectively to change completely. I think the most interesting thing to me at the present time is the way in which, since China opened up in the late 1970s, and what Ford, which was invited by Beijing to open an office there, I think in 1979 or 1980, what they've been doing, which is where, for example, what you've got there is an increasingly powerful state, a state with a bit more kind of ambition in terms of power to be independent of the United States, but using Western and particularly American resources, intellectual resources, to try to modernize the way in which they see the world and the way in which they effectively deal with their internal problems. And it's interesting that just as the US foundations came out of a period of mass industrialization, urbanization and migration, immigration, to some extent China is undergoing quite a large scale transformation of that character itself. Millions of people are moving from the agriculture to industry, from the villages, rural areas to the big cities and towns. And this has created a very large amount of fermenting, a lot of discontent in various ways. And it strikes me as quite appropriate that they should look to American institutions to help them to cope with it. So when you look at what Ford has been doing, they've been helping village electoral processes, healthcare delivery in the localities, but also building up what is allegedly a civil society set of organizations as well. But most of the money that Ford has been investing in China has gone to organizations which appear to be private, but actually are licensed or are working directly for a ministry of the Chinese government. So they've invented a kind of acronym to sum up this, and it's called GONGOs, Government Organized Non-Governmental Organizations. And it seems to be that what Ford is doing, and many other foundations since then, is actually helping to build an infrastructure of the Chinese state which is not as centralized as the official structures of the Chinese state. So you've got kind of halfway houses between the public and the private sector, which are being funded by private institutions, and this is all kind of legitimized and endorsed by the American state itself, because it's happened, if you like, intertwined with the State Department and other agencies. And in fact, the whole program of opening up China, which paved the way for Kissinger and for Nixon in the late 60s, early 70s, was actually provided by these private institutions like Ford, actually, which built all sorts of scholarly and other relationships with key institutions there. And then after the death of Mao, they actually came into full flower. So the Chinese, if you like, are kind of resisting Americanization And they're trying to sort of operate as if there's a kind of supermarket and they're the consumer, and that they can pick and choose what they want of these American institutions. And it'd be interesting to see, because it's probably the first time a non-Western state, which has significant power, is engaging in a relationship as people who can say, no, we don't want you, when these institutions step too far. And it's interesting how the American institutions appear to have adapted in various ways to try to fit in with the Chinese own indigenous project. But it may well be that there's a coincidence of wants there, that the stability of China is actually a vital American national interest, and that a China which fits into and has come to where it is today within the kind of American-led order, and is willing to change its rules and its kind of domestic economy and regulation of that economy in order to fit into the WTO's requirements, for example, appears to want to end to the US-led order. The United States wants them in the US-led order as well, and try to curb the degree to which there may be friction between the two, each one trying to use the other to leverage its position and to kind of strengthen its position. So there, the forms of resistance appear to be coming straight from the Communist Party of China and from the Chinese state. In other places, it is very, very difficult, because when even what look like reform movements and radical movements are kind of getting support from these foundations, they are usually poor, they're usually on the margins of tolerance by the state, and having some connection with a Western institution gives them a measure of protection. And it also has a sort of, it puts that state's tolerance levels in the shop window as well. It's very difficult to do very much about those institutions. Resisting them is actually very, very difficult. I think it's very difficult. I don't think I've found that many examples of outright resistance to them, even in a country like Indonesia, for example, where there was an anti-Western government in the period of the Cold War, which said, to hell with your aid. But I've seen letters from Sukarno actually thanking the Ford Foundation for its good work in that country. So he who overtly wished to build a national path to development saw this as something which could aid that, but didn't see through what he was actually doing, which was really undermining that regime.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.